Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us again. This is round 2 of our special NetSpeed pre-conference interviews with our keynote speaker from day 2, Professor Sean Gouglas. Of course, if you hadn't yet, and I need to give, hi Sean, I need to give the pitch for NetSpeed. If you haven't yet registered for NetSpeed, please do. You only have a couple days left. But of course, for those who aren't able to attend, who would like to get a little bit of content beforehand, and who just want to watch a great interview with one of the great thinkers in the realm of video gaming, as well as how that relates to librarianship, this is the interview for you today. My name is Lauren Sergi. I am the communications strategist with the Alberta Library, and here with me today, as I mentioned, is the lovely Professor Sean Gouglas. And as we were getting prepped here, we realized that I had a slightly out-of-date bio, so I'm going to read this to make sure that I get it right. Sean Gouglas is professor in Humanities Computing in the Faculty of Arts, and his research focuses on the relationship between universities and the computer game industry in Canada, especially as it relates to curriculum development and intellectual property. Librarians, listen up. And on the role of women in computer games as characters, players, and developers. Sean has run a massive online open course, also known as a MOOC, called Understanding Video Games. This course was an outstanding success. The first iteration alone had over 29,000 students from 154 countries participating. That is absolutely incredible. His Twitter feed bio, because I liked it, I'm going to read it for you, is short and to the point. He is professor, partner, father, geek, and just recently told me that he likes long walks on beaches, but not really. I give you Sean Gouglas. Thank you, Sean, so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I've got this mental image of you growing up as stereotypical early gamer geek, and I do apologize if that is not the correct image, but I can just see you in your cave with the Commodore 64 controller in hand, like never leaving the basement. Is this true?
Of me?
Yes.
No, it is not true of me. I was actually, as much as I could, stealing into the houses of my friends because they were the ones who had either the Commodore 64 or the Atari VCS or something like that. No, I was and still am a PC gamer. So I had an IBM XT that we had, which was one of the old 8088 chips that came out in 81, 82. If you're watching Halt and Catch Fire, it's kind of like the Netflix show. It's actually around that sort of time period. And so I would be writing some silly little code on that and playing games and trying to create Dungeons and Dragons character creators and all these sorts of things in BASIC. So that is the type of gamer I was, rather than a console gamer. And I still am a PC gamer.
You're a gamer after my own heart then, because I love the PC format. I grew up on the PC format, stealing my brother's PC video games. Never developed any dexterity with a controller.
Agreed. I don't know what this is.
What is this? Like, it's like you get the mouse and keyboard going and you can just like...
I'm a mouse and keyboard person, exactly.
Good stuff.
Interestingly enough, I don't know how old you are, but there's actually a lot of research that shows, and this is one of the things that we do talk about in the course, that particularly women who are, let's say, just to pick a number randomly, over 25 or over 30, many of their first experiences with games is actually through computers or consoles that belong to someone else. So either a boyfriend or a brother or something like that. And so there's a lot of interesting research going on, and by some of my research partners, that talks exactly about how women gain access and expertise in computer games mediated through another person, usually a brother or boyfriend. And so your comment there was actually very telling to some of this thing that's going on, that you had to steal your brother's video game.
Well, and it's kind of funny along those lines, because at least in my household, and this is more info about me than you need to know, but we'll do it anyway. In my household growing up, I was the youngest of 7. And my older siblings were already entering university by the time I came around. So I never knew a time when we didn't have some form of gaming device, like starting with the Commodore 64 and PCs, when we didn't have that in the house. So we were kind of, I don't know if that was early adopters in there, but they were always around for me growing up. It was just primarily my brothers who played them. But I used to love watching them play Eye of the Beholder on the PC.
Oh my God, that's a Gold Box game. Those are my favorite series of games, the Gold Box series of games from SSI. They are spectacular, and they are my absolute love. I talk about them in the course. Eye of the Beholder, Curse of the Azure Bonds, all of these fabulous, fabulous Gold Box games.
They were amazing.
You just made my day that you referenced that.
It was a great way to grow up. Oh, it was so good. So
absolutely.
How did your interest, because obviously your interest in video games has pretty much always been there, even though you had to steal your friends' devices at first. How did your interest in video games grow into what it is today?
So in some ways, I guess my story is unusual, but it's only unusual in the sense that all the people who are of my age who are in game studies, well, there were PhDs in game studies when we were coming and going through our research and through our PhDs. Many of us were coming through other disciplines and thought, oh, well, maybe I can apply some of this to games. So for people like me, my route was actually through history. My PhD's in history on topics that are nothing to do with video games. It's actually sort of geospatial statistical analysis of settlement in Southern Ontario, which has very little to do with computer games.
I was hired code to me, to be honest. So
it's
coding.
The link is there, but it takes a lot of getting used to. So I was actually, because of my interest in how computers can be used to facilitate teaching and research in topics in the Faculty of Arts, like any broadly construed topic, I was hired in 2001 to come to the University of Alberta to start a graduate program in something called Humanities Computing. And there were a bunch of courses that two of us were hired to teach in this graduate program. It was the second one in the world and the first in North America. And so one of the courses in that was a multimedia course. And my friend, Stefan, who was the other person who was hired, who has since left, I almost said moved on, which sounds like he died. He's at McGill now. I'm not dead. The multimedia course was, well, he didn't play games and I did. So we thought we would start this multimedia course on games, which was around 2003, 2004. And then I started to realize that I actually didn't like geospatial statistic settlement models of Southern Ontario when I could study games. And very slowly, over about 4 or 5 years, my research changed entirely from history to video games.
I can't imagine why you would feel that way.
I know, it's astonishing, isn't it?
Well, and there was Go ahead, Sean, sorry.
I was just saying, I look back on everything. Every step that, as it was happening, seemed really quite iterative. Yeah. But you look back on where you started and where you end up, and you're like, how did I get here? And thanks somebody for getting me here, because I just love what I do. So.
Well, because I noticed that in part of your CV, you also have studies in early 20th century urban and agricultural history.
That would be my PhD.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, with your considerable academic experience in history, when you moved on to the video games, did you kind of leave that behind, or does that still inform what it is you do today, or are they totally separate?
You're the first person who's ever asked me that. That's a really interesting question. I think because most people don't appreciate that a PhD isn't about generating specific detailed knowledge in a specific area. Of course it is, but that's not what it's for. A PhD is to learn how to go through the process of developing that specific deep knowledge in a particular area. And so yes, you do get a domain expertise. The domain expertise in Southern Ontario, 19th and 20th century agricultural history is not explicitly transferable to video games, but the methodologies for doing research, the statistical analysis, the geospatial analysis and coding that went into all of that, the ability to understand the historiography of a discipline and how to do deep and considered learning and thinking about a topic, that's readily transferable. So there are ways of learning that are transferable, and there are also methodologies. So I still do a lot of statistical analysis. We have a huge project that was a big Facebook scrape on a conversation that went on for about 4 or 5 months a number of years ago.
Okay.
And it's heavily stats based.
Yeah.
And so that's research that's taken from our methodology that's taken from my thesis and transferred. But no, the content, the domain expertise is not the same by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, like you said, though, if the methodology can transfer over and you can apply this one skill set that you had in terms of the stats and the research and how you look at different topics and measure and quantify them and then transfer it into the video games, that process, that learning is still valuable in the other realm. And I think that's where a lot of librarians do feel a bit of kinship. Even if we're not involved in academic research, we feel a bit of kinship there, because so often we're required to say, okay, I don't know about subject X, but I do know about this, and this is a little related to that because of, just the natures of our job require us to sort of think that way. Yeah.
Which is, I love librarians and the contribution they make. I have many of my friends are librarians here, and the contribution you guys make to the way in which research is conducted is invaluable. There's so many little trite sayings about education, but the one that I love and I kind of latch on to, and I'm not sure I'm getting it exactly right, is an education is what remains when the content has been forgotten.
I like that.
And I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And librarians help make that happen.
It's in the application, not in the little trivia pieces that you learn. Really.
Yeah,
at least that's
absolutely. You're not getting an education so you can do well in Jeopardy.
Yeah. So obviously you think that video games is a worthwhile pursuit. It is the entirety of your pursuit right now, except the long walks on the beaches, of course. Can you tell us what it is? Of course.
And we have one in Edmonton now.
We do, but apparently it's very dangerous to get to now and is going to sink back into the swamp, so to speak. So
it was beautiful while it lasted.
And I haven't even seen that thing yet. What is it about video games that make them such a valuable activity?
Well, that question can be addressed in a whole number of ways.
Pick the way that you feel strongest about.
I'm actually going to start with the way that most people address it, and I think it's actually the least valuable. And
okay.
I mean, as an economic motivator, it's remarkable. It is in my mind, well, it is the single largest media form in the world right now. It's bigger than movies. It's bigger than music, just in terms of its economic output. Mm-hmm. And it's bigger than both of them combined. And it has been for quite some time, 5-6 years now. So that's, I think, interesting. But, that's great, but those are just numbers. I think why video games are so important is because and it's a phrase I've used before, it is possibly one of the first cultural touchstones that many Canadians, 2 or 3 generations of Canadians have grown up with now. I have 2 girls, they would rather play video games than do anything else. I grew up, and there's a generation between, so there's 3 generations of Canadians who have experienced video games as one of their first sort of forms of media that they can consume and make their own. And I think understanding that and understanding how that consumption and even the production of video games is influencing the way Canadians think about themselves and influencing a way in which people think about their gender or their race or their ethnicity. All of these things I think are fascinating questions, and that's why I think video games are important to study, not because of their economic input, which is of course important, but it's tangential, I think, to the social and cultural aspects that video games bring for us or apply to us. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, with those social aspects, there's very much a darker side of games that we hear about a lot in the media because they make interesting, easy clickbait stories. But how can we navigate? I love games. I hate that all the focus is on the dark side. But regarding the dark side, how can we navigate that side of games as well as of gamer culture, both in terms of navigating it ourselves and in helping other people like library users or even our own kids kind of negotiate that space?
Oh my goodness, that's a
Solve the world's problems in 3 sentences or less, man.
turn the computer off. No, I mean, I have no answer to that in the sense of I think it's in many ways an insolvable problem. You see this every day manifesting in different ways, not just in computer games, but the same forces that are at work, the same people who are creating environments in games where open hostility and sort of rabid right-wing demagoguery is sort of one of the things in which we just all have to deal. That's the same sort of forces, and you can even track the same people who are making the same arguments in politics,
Yeah.
film, in Charlottesville. Like, I mean, all of these groups are different parts of the same forces. And so, video games are one of those sorts of battlegrounds, I guess. And I mean, you look at companies that are trying to deal with this vitriol and this abuse. Overwatch, for example, has just come out with an article today or yesterday, or articles on Overwatch just came out today and yesterday about how the companies that run this are just struggling to try and deal with the sort of increased hatred and abuse that's occurring on these forums. And it's so challenging that they're actually having to put off upgrading the game because they're spending so much resources on just trying to make the forums and the conversations manageable for new and returning users, so they just don't quit because they just hate the toxic nature of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
This is not an unsolvable problem, and games need to deal with it specifically. But it is part of a broader conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that with the entire Gamergate struggle that took place 3 or 4 years ago. These are forces that are difficult to sort of unravel from other broader social issues. It does seem to have a particularly virulent strain in video game research. There are reasons for that, I think, but it's still very difficult to unpack and fix.
Mm-hmm. And I would think that, like you said, it certainly isn't isolated to video games, but the people, a lot of the perpetuation in it it's almost like video games is a good petri dish for some of this.
Well, maybe, yeah.
the proverbial
back to an initial conversation.
Yes. Well, I have noticed that there is, of course, it is important, I think, for the game companies to acknowledge and work with it and try to work through it. I have noticed, though, kind of the counterculture to the stuff that gave rise to Gamergate, to the real toxicity in many of the other communities. My husband is a big fan of Day of Defeat, which is a World War II first-person shooter style game. And it is a completely violence-based game. There's no question about that. But within the
it's a war game.
It's a war game. Exactly. You go and you shoot the other person. But within the server that he plays on, the community has established really rigid rules of decorum and of behavior. There are no references to people's families allowed, including no yo mama jokes, because that starts fighting. Very little swearing is allowed. You're not allowed to make any comment that has to do with gender. And what I was surprised about was how tightly it's policed. They'll kick people out the minute that they violate one of those. It's just bang. Nope, this is a clean environment, because otherwise you're wrecking it for everyone. So there is the toxicity there, but there's also a really strong culture and community of support. I just think it's unfortunate that what you most often see in the media is the toxicity, because games are awesome.
I think you're touching on a whole bunch of really interesting things. We had a research project that we sort of played around with, but it never really got off the ground. But what we found, even in just our initial findings on that one, when we were doing some early interviews, was that many female gamers that we were interviewing who objected to the sort of abuse, gee, I wonder why, that was actually going on in these communities. What they ended up doing was similar to what your husband's experience was, which is they would create their own walled gardens, and they would become the administrators that would allow for certain people to come in. So we interviewed a bunch of people who were doing some really interesting things with some, as much traditional style game like Call of Duty or whatever, where they were creating environments where there was acceptable behaviors and there were unacceptable behaviors. They were outlined very clearly in the terms of reference, and you got maybe 1 or 2 warnings, and then you were gone.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting was many of these women were actually grad students or had finished grad degrees, which we didn't expect, but ended up I think we ended up interviewing 5 or 6 people sort of randomly, so kind of a snowballing. And they all had grad degrees in English or in comparative literature or something like that, which we thought was kind of weird, but we just never really pursued the project too much, but it was sort of an interesting sort of way to go. And as much as you see individual players and the sort of expertise of individual players trying to create these communities that are more hospitable to new players or to people of a particular sex or gender or whatever, it's interesting watching companies struggle with this because the size of the communities are substantially different, and that sort of difference in size is making it incredibly difficult to solve technologically. So it's kind of interesting to watch that struggle take place, and you see it on every large community. League of Legends, for example, is struggling with this issue terribly. It's a toxic wasteland in many ways, and they've tried to do a couple of things, but their user community just rebels against it, and then they have to come up with something else.
Right. It's the proverbial herding of cats.
Yes, well, although, I mean, I reject the argument that we can't look after or try and clean up the video game communities because everything else in society is bad. I just think that's a ridiculous argument. It's like saying, to me, it's like saying we can't clean the kitchen because the bathroom's dirty. I'm sorry, I simply don't buy that. We can try and clean up the video game community as well. And there are interesting strategies.
Yeah, you see people doing just that. They're not waiting for other people to clean it up. They're creating, like you said, their own walled gardens where they can have this community in and of themselves. Now, there is, of course, a big community focus within video games. So much of it is social playing. And within the libraries, a really lovely thing that I find about video games being brought into the libraries and encouraged there is that you see person-to-person communities forming. You get different people coming in physically to the library to spend time playing together. So to what degree do you think that gaming in these really social environments can kind of create those more, I don't want to say politer communities, but those more pro-social communities, like taking the games into the public sphere?
I think that's an interesting question. It pulls on a couple of threads. One, there are theories about why people can or choose to be so vitriolic on game forums or in game spaces, especially where anonymity is allowed. And anonymity is one of them. Yeah. One of the reasons why people think that. Or anonymity without consequences is one of the possibilities. And there are a lot of gaming arenas and forums and sites where they are anonymous and there are no consequences for vitriolic behavior, and therefore it just descends into this cesspool of grossness. I'm just going to copyright that, cesspool of grossness. Kind of redundant. Anyways, moving on. So when you bring gaming into a public forum where you have to sit in front of someone in a community and call them that name to their face, that changes the dynamic a lot. So I think that's kind of cool. And there is a lot of interesting work that's going on about sort of mobile gaming or ubiquitous gaming or games that are brought out into public spaces. Pokemon Go, for example, was the huge hit last year, and I still play it with my girls. And
we took the kids to the Valley Zoo, and the zoo was completely taken over by Pokemon Go players. They had created an event there. We had no idea. We just thought there was an unusual number of people wandering around, staring at their phones instead of at the animals, until we ran into a friend of ours who's an avid player. Said, "Oh yeah, no, we're all here."
They were staring at the animals, just different ones. So I mean, Pokemon Go's got a lot of interesting things in its UI. You do interact with other people, but you can't communicate with them. So there's you can't call them whatever, or tell them to go make you a sandwich, or whatever the sort of various slags that you can think of. But you can still work collaboratively with these people in public spaces. And so that's a really sort of interesting way. And you didn't see a ton of vitriolic behavior in the playing of that game. That's not the same thing as saying you didn't see a lot of vitriolic behavior in the forums that described that or supported that. Of course, you're going to see that, unfortunately. But Niantic did some interesting things with that game to ensure that the community couldn't or wouldn't be able to interact in a way, which is why I feel perfectly comfortable having, at the time, my 5-year-old walk around campus playing that game. It was, they loved it.
So interdisciplinary work, and I'm going to pull it back to that for just a moment, because there's, like you said, with every question you answer, there's this comment, there's so many threads to it, there's so many pieces to it. And I think that training ourselves to look for those different pieces and those different angles is really important. As I mentioned earlier, interdisciplinary work is kind of a de facto job description for many librarians, because so many of us need to be jacks of all trades thanks just to the demands of our jobs in the working environment. But oddly enough, our professional culture can be very insular. We look within our own culture and our own profession for knowledge and for innovation and for advancement. And sometimes it almost feels as though we believe that the only people who can or maybe should meaningfully contribute to the library field are librarians themselves. And of course, this brings up a host of issues of lack of innovation and silo thinking. So as someone who moved from these spaces of history to gaming to interdisciplinary work to working with libraries, like you've worked everywhere and with pretty much every kind of research, what advice could you give us in terms of shedding that kind of silo thinking and adopting a more interdisciplinary type mindset?
I was also an archaeologist in between there.
Because why not?
Why not? Yeah, I helped run a field school in Greece for 3 years because...
Oh, I adore you. This is fantastic.
It was actually one of the... Sorry, I know this is a complete aside, but when I was doing my PhD, I was using geospatial data to do my thesis, but I knew of GIS and what it could do because I had been running a consulting company that was mapping archaeological sites in Southern Ontario, just to help pay the bills when I was doing my PhD. And so when I got to U of A, one of the classics professors came into my office and asked me 3 questions. And the first was, is it true you know how to do computer mapping? I'm like, yes. Do you know how to do surveying as well as part of archaeological sites? I'm like, yeah, I did that for years. Would you like to come to Greece to map my archaeology site for me? Yes, I would. It's
like he came in with this job description. It's like, oh, I need this person.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyway, so your question, so I'm going to start by going back a little bit to the way you prefaced the question, and that is, when I talk to my students, what I tell them is the smartest thing you can say when someone asks you a question is and it's not a way to back out, and it's not a way to, not answer the question. But if you are going to be a thoughtful, considered person trying to address these issues, the first thing you can say is, it's complicated. Because it is complicated as soon as you deal with human beings. And so people who I always go back to the Princess Bride, right? Anyone who's trying to tell you it's easy is trying to sell you something. If someone tells you that it's simple, they're not dealing with people. People are complicated. So when we deal with an issue like climate change, to pick something relevant, is climate change an economic issue? Well, yes. Is it a social issue? Yes. Is it a racial and ethnic issue? Absolutely. Is it a global development issue? Yeah, it's all of those things. So which department would you put climate change in if you were trying to put it into a nice little silo? Well, the answer is nowhere or everywhere. So that's why I think interdisciplinary studies is important, because it allows the really sort of deep considered thinking that has gone on in some departments, like in economics or in computing science or whatever, to take that sort of deep understanding and start trying to apply it in meaningful ways to the in a way that considers the language and terminology and methodologies of other disciplines. And getting those people to speak to each other is really challenging because the ways in which they think about problems are different, and the way terms they use to think about problems are different, and the methodologies they use are different. And why I think interdisciplinary studies is so important is because it provides an informed middle ground to have all of these communities talk to each other about issues that clearly don't fall into a single discipline. So where that informed middle ground, I think, can be found is in two places. One, well, maybe three places. Most people are actually more interdisciplinary than they think they are. So you can find them kind of everywhere. But the second place is in interdisciplinary departments, where this is their explicit focus. And this is what we did here and what we do here at the University of Alberta in the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies. And the last place is in libraries. Those are the people who I think have access to and consideration for a multitude of approaches to disciplines. It struggles with the institutional biases that promote disciplinarity. My tenure case and my promotion case all had to go through the history department, meaning I had historians telling me whether or not I would pass muster for tenure and promotion, even though none of them did video game studies. Yeah. It's really interesting, right? You have to manage a system for promotion and tenure and publication and all these sorts of things within a framework that is built upon disciplines. They're breaking down. It's one of the sort of pillars of the Social Science Humanities Research Council's mandate is interdisciplinary studies. It's their fourth pillar. So you see it changing, but it's still hard. And so it's easy for me to say, especially since I have tenure, for me to say to an up-and-coming scholar, don't worry about it. Just do your interdisciplinary stuff. Well, that's great. That's lovely advice to give when, that person is going to have to get tenure in a department. Librarians as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting struggle and a constant challenge, but I think it's worth it.
I agree. I like the interdisciplinary stuff. It's like you said with the stuff that you learned, even though you weren't necessarily working in the history sphere anymore, those principles that you learned could be applied to the video games. That way of learning and ways of knowing can still be applied across cultures. And I do firmly believe that libraries, such as the ones who have brought you into work for them, you're a very easy example because you're right in front of me, of course, but who have brought people like you into work with them, end up enriching the profession that much more rather than thinking, okay, so librarians know libraries. So what do librarians know about this? So it's good to get those brains coming in. I've got one more question for you. And of course, we have to make it a slightly goofy one. Are there any areas of video games or video game culture that just leave you scratching your head, that you just can't wrap your brain around?
Absolutely.
Whatever.
I can answer that. I don't even have to think twice about that question. I mean, I don't understand the vitriol. I just don't understand why you think you need to tell someone to do horrible, horrible things, like how you feel that makes you a better person or gives you any sort of sense of worth. That I just don't understand. But in terms of video game culture that I do not understand, Twitch. I don't get it. I don't understand the watching of other people playing games. I mean, I get it. I think it's interesting, but I would rather play than... Yeah. And I'm obviously alone on this because the number of people who watched the Dota World Championships over 12 or 13 days was 332 million people. Now that's a lot of people watching people play video games on streaming, right? Like that's a lot of people.
That's a huge audience.
That's a huge number, right? Like that's enormous. So,
and if you look at YouTube, the most popular YouTubers, like PewDiePie and whatnot, they're the video game streamers.
Absolutely. And I mean, I understand it's performative and many of these people are funny, though not PewDiePie. Some of these, like, I think it's interesting. But I don't get it. I am too old to see this as a valuable use of my time when I'd rather be. I just started finally started playing Rise of the Tomb Raider, and I'm loving it. It's fantastic. But watching someone else play it, why would I do that? So yeah, so Twitch, I don't get it. But then I'm old, so.
Well, I don't get it either, and I'm not young, but I don't think I'm as old as you are.
Oh, that's kind.
I was actually trying to parse that out based off of your CV. It's like, so reasonably, he's probably about the age of my older brothers. So I would have stolen your video games as a kid. There we go.
I'm 27.
You know what? We can go with that. In which case I am older than you. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Sean. This was absolutely wonderful. It's a great intro to you, to what you do, to how you think, that I think is just going to make the keynote at NetSpeed that much richer. For those of you who are going to NetSpeed, you will get the chance to see Sean live in action, not Twitch, but still live in action there. For those of you who aren't going to NetSpeed, I do hope that you thoroughly enjoyed this interview, that you found it as interesting and as valuable as I did. And if you're thinking about going to NetSpeed, for the love of Pete, register, because you've got about a week left to register, and that is it. Sean, thank you so much. I look forward to the next time we chat, and to everyone else, I'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much.